Well, sorry not to be there with you, but I hope the internet holds up and I can join in the discussion afterwards. So I'm just going to say a few words to make the claim that objectivity is important. It's necessary for science, and we need to understand knowledge as objective in a certain sense. I'll now define. So this is the principle I'm using, following Popper, to say something objectively exists. Namely, if one can be wrong about something, it must have an existence independent of one's subjective knowledge. So knowledge itself objectively exists when one could be subjectively wrong about it. There are, I'll claim, objective relations between theories, predictions, and data. For example, I think this is the way we should understand why p-hacking is wrong. P-hacking is wrong precisely because it misrepresents the relation between data and claims. And if it can misrepresent that relationship, there must be an objective relationship, an independently existing relationship between data and claims that is independent of what we believe about that relationship, so it objectively exists. Because if that wasn't so, p-hacking wouldn't be wrong, but p-hacking is wrong. In fact, I'll make the somewhat broader claim that a discipline is an academic discipline when the arguments in that field, relevant to that field, are considered for their own sake. That is, considered as having objective properties apart from the person proposing them. This is what would distinguish an academic field from, for example, religion, a cult, or something else. So consider the denial of what I just said. So let's take the claim there is no objective knowledge, just subjective states of knowing. So that's what there is to deny objective knowledge. Well, there's only what people actually subjectively know in their head. Knowledge, in fact, does not have objective properties to be discovered. Now, it follows, if you accepted this claim, that arguments do not have objective reasons supporting them. Therefore, there are no objective reasons for the claim. Therefore, I reject the claim. That is, I accept the existence of objective knowledge. I just want you to bear in mind, because I think this covers the sorts of kickback one might have against what I just said, that objective knowledge is, according to Popper, whose notions I'm expounding here, is constructed by humans, it's constructed by us. It evolves over time. Lakatos even argues that case for mathematics. It can be vague and ambiguous, and it reflects our interests. But even though all those things are true and important, objective knowledge still has properties we can be wrong about, so it has an objective existence. So once you invent a theory, it has a reality of its own. Theories are invented by people, they're constructions of people. But when this scientist here has invented some theory, there's a network of objective relationships between assumptions, observation claims, predictions, and so on. And she can represent those assumptions in her mind, so she subjectively thinks certain things, but doesn't mean she got it right. Doesn't mean she actually understood what predictions followed. Sometimes you have to work out what the predictions are. I mean, this is clear in the case of a mathematical theory. Einstein spent several days working out that the general theory of relativity did indeed predict the perihelion, the movement of Mercury, and was absolutely over the moon and delighted when he found that. That was something he had to discover. But it's also true of psychological theories and other theories. Certain theories, by which I just mean general claims of interest that are, in other words, fairly broad, that can make predictions, given certain assumptions. They make certain predictions given certain assumptions, and there will be objective, logical, and inferential relationships that exist between the theory, the assumptions, and the predictions. So I've represented that here. For example, a substantial theory could be something like extrinsic motivation crowds out intrinsic motivation. That's a broad statement with some generality and of interest. Now, we can make certain assumptions and make particular predictions, namely we predict certain phenomenon. For example, telling kids that they can only eat their dessert if they eat their broccoli. Can contrast that to a case where the broccoli is not simply instrumental in eating the dessert, and the claim is in the first case, when broccoli is instrumental to eating the dessert, you'll reduce the intrinsic motivation and the liking of the broccoli by the kids. That's a particular prediction given certain assumptions that can follow from the theory, and you can collect data that can be supportive or against or indifferent to that prediction, and there will be it will be a matter of fact whether these relationships are in fact what we consider them to be. Now, I think this way of looking at what happens in science is how we make sense of open science reforms. Open science reforms make sense because they enable reasoning to be guided by objective relations between theory, predictions, and data. That's why we have open data, materials, and code. So we can check for mistakes. We can check that the materials implement the characteristics they claim to implement. That's something we can be wrong about and therefore has an objective existence independent of what we might want and believe. We can check that the code does what it claims it does. We can check that if you run the code on the data, you reproduce the results, and there's no errors. These are matters of objective fact, at least to some extent. Of course, there's always some vagueness there, as I said before, but that doesn't mean there aren't facts of the matter. In other words, things we can be wrong about in our subjective beliefs. And if you just thought open science, the contrast position is open science provides just another subjective narrative, or it's just a new set of conventions researchers intersubjectively agree with. But that doesn't explain why open science improves science if you took that subjectivist position. It's not just another subjective narrative. It's important that open science does reduce our particular reforms do reduce our errors, our misrepresentations of the relationships between data, predictions, and theory. And if they haven't done that, then they haven't worked. There's all sorts of narratives and conventions we can have, but if they don't help us in reducing our biases in understanding the relationship between theory, predictions, and data, then they're not good reforms. So does it matter? Yes, a notion of the objectivity of knowledge really does matter in understanding and improving what we're doing. Otherwise, if we don't have that notion, we're rudderless in terms of the reform movement. I'll just give another couple examples where I think it does matter. Consider an equivalence test where you need to set an equivalence region and you want to test a theory, but you set the equivalence region according to the minimal effect that the resources of that lab is able to detect. Okay, or consider a base factor where the model of H1 is just a default model and has not been chosen as relevant to the theory that's being tested. Both these examples, the objective properties of the theories and their predictions in the scientific context are ignored. The resources of the lab are irrelevant to what a theory predicts in a certain situation. So setting up an equivalence test based on the resources of the lab is not to respect the objective properties of the theories and therefore is not to test the theory. And that's why that is not an acceptable way of defining an equivalence region. And also a default base factor by the same token is not acceptable just to be pulled off the shelf and you press a button. You're not necessarily testing a theory. But the only way of understanding why that is so is to understand that knowledge has objective properties. Okay, I'll leave it there, and I hope that stimulates some discussion which I can join in on. Thanks very much.